The air hung heavy and salty over the Soviet port town of Ventspils, a thick, humid curtain drawn across the twilight sky. It was a mundane Monday, yet beneath the corrugated iron roof of a dilapidated boathouse, a desperate, meticulous tension thrummed. Inside, sweat beaded on the brow of Valentin Savitsky, a 36-year-old former Soviet naval engineer. His clothes, worn and dusted with fiberglass resin, clung to his slender frame. He wasn't repairing a fishing trawler or refurbishing a patrol boat. He was assembling an escape vessel, a defiant thumb-sized craft against the colossal fist of the Soviet state, a homemade, one-man submarine. The single, bare bulb swinging precariously overhead cast stark, sickly yellow light onto the bizarre contraption. It lay cradled in makeshift wooden supports, a Frankensteinian tube built from scavenged materials. The main hull was a repurposed railway fuel tank, only about 5.5 meters long and a meter wide, painted a dull, non-reflective gray. Savitsky had spent nearly 3 years on this project, a monumental feat of clandestine engineering. Every bolt, every weld, every piece of wiring had been acquired through a complex, silent network of small-time theft, bribery, and forged requisitions. He'd even fabricated a plausible, though thin, cover story for the boatyard foreman, claiming he was developing a deep-sea research bathyscaphe for a closed-off, fictitious institute in Leningrad. The foreman, a weary, alcoholic man named Dmitri, rarely asked questions as long as the occasional bottle of good vodka appeared. Savitsky ran a gloved hand over the small, conical bow, feeling the slightly rough texture of the marine epoxy he'd mixed himself. The sheer audacity of the plan, to cross the heavily patrolled Baltic Sea from the Soviet Union to neutral Sweden, through the very heart of the Soviet Navy's coastal defense system, was almost suicidal. But the alternative, a life strangled by the bureaucratic inertia and soul-crushing scarcity of the late Soviet Union, felt like a slower, more agonizing death. His dream was simple, and yet impossibly distant. Freedom, the ability to invent, to live without the shadow of the KGB's ever-present scrutiny. He knelt by the stern, checking the propeller shaft one last time. It was driven by a modified electric motor scavenged from a trolleybus and powered by a bank of heavy-duty car batteries, packed into the aft compartment. This was the vessel's Achilles heel. The batteries offered a limited range and top speed of maybe 4 knots. To conserve power, he had fitted an ingenious bicycle pedal mechanism that would allow him to manually turn the propeller in long stretches of travel, a brutally physical requirement for a journey of over 150 nautical miles. The tiny control compartment, just enough space for him to sit in a semi-fetal position, housed a rudimentary depth gauge, a directional Euro compass salvaged from an old bomber, and a single periscope cobbled together from various optical parts. Outside, a light, insistent rain began to fall, pattering against the tin roof like a drumbeat. It was a blessing. The rain would keep the handful of port workers indoors and mute the sounds of his final preparations. Tonight was the night. He had monitored the weather, the tide charts, and the Soviet Navy's patrol schedules, information he had retained from his days in the fleet. There was a narrow, 6-hour window of reduced aerial and naval surveillance, a fluke of a training exercise rotation, and a scheduled fog advisory for the area of the Erb Strait. He had to be in the water before the next shift of border guards came on duty at 0200 hours. The clock was ticking, not in minutes, but in the rapid, heavy thumps of his own heart. He pulled a small, worn photograph of his mother and pressed it briefly to his lips, then sealed it inside a waterproof pouch tucked into the chest of his worn naval sweater. He was ready to slip into the sea, into the cold, silent world of his own making, a world that offered either the ultimate liberty or the icy embrace of the Baltic Deep. He wrestled a final, heavy lead ballast weight into the hull, the metallic clang echoing sharply in the silence, before he dampened it with a thick rag. The homemade hatch, a heavy steel disc, lay waiting beside the opening, ready to seal him into his solitary, desperate voyage. Valentin Savitsky wiped the sweat and rain from his eyes and listened intently. The steady sound of the rain was his friend, muffling the agonizing scrape of steel on wood as he began the process of moving the submarine, which he'd christened Pravda, Truth, with a dark, private irony, out of the boathouse. The total weight, fully ballasted and with him inside, was just under 4 metric tons. The old wooden floor groaned under the strain as he leveraged the hull onto a set of heavy, greased rollers he'd prepared months ago. He worked with a cold, almost surgical precision, every movement rehearsed countless times in his mind, every creak and echo registered. He knew precisely how much pressure he could apply before the noise became suspicious. He used a manually operated chain hoist, usually employed for lifting engine blocks, to inch the vessel toward the large, double-wide doors that opened directly onto the dock. The entire process of the launch preparation took nearly 2 agonizing hours, hours in which every passing car, every distant shout, felt like a thunderclap signaling his capture. At 1:30, the nose of Pravda was finally poking out into the night air. The rain had slowed to a drizzle, and a thick, clammy sea fog was rolling in, a fortunate development that would dramatically reduce visibility from any coastal observation posts. Meanwhile, less than 5 kilometers away, at the regional headquarters of the KGB's Border Guard Directorate in Ventspils, Major Viktor Reznikov was nursing a mug of bitter, lukewarm coffee. Reznikov was a career security officer, meticulous and intensely loyal, whose world was defined by schedules, protocols, and the absolute certainty of Soviet naval supremacy in the Baltic. His area of responsibility was the Iron Coast, the western seaboard of the Latvian SSR, a supposedly impenetrable shield against NATO incursions, and, perhaps more urgently, against defection. His desk was stacked with reports, including a newly filed, vague inventory discrepancy from the Ventspils Port Authority. Specifically, the unexplained loss of a significant length of high-voltage cabling and several sheets of specialized, pressure-resistant fiberglass. The report, filed weeks late by the drunken foreman, Dmitry, was a low-priority bureaucratic annoyance, but it sat uneasily in the back of Reznikov's mind. He instinctively distrusted sloppiness. In the Soviet security apparatus, sloppiness meant vulnerability. Reznikov stretched, looking out his window at the encroaching fog. His gut told him something was off with the rotation schedule for the Project 1241.1 missile boats, known to NATO as Tarantul-class corvettes, assigned to the patrol area tonight. There was a gap, a poorly explained detour for a vessel suffering minor engine trouble, a detail that was supposed to be irrelevant. No vessel is irrelevant, Reznikov thought. He picked up the port inventory report again, his fingers tracing the oddly specific missing items. Why would anyone steal specialized fiberglass? It had no easy black market value. It was only useful for one thing, something designed to withstand water pressure. Back at the boathouse, Valentin was making the final commitment. He released the last safety winch, and the submarine slid down the wooden ramp with a low, controlled shush and met the cold Baltic water. There was a brief, terrifying moment when the bow dipped too low, a rush of cold water over the deck before the ballast tanks stabilized the vessel. It floated, low in the water, a dark, barely visible shadow in the fog. He climbed onto the hull, secured his few belongings, a navigational chart, a thermos of tea, and a small loaf of rye bread, inside the narrow cockpit, and then lowered himself into the cramped metal tomb. The air inside immediately smelled of oil, electrical insulation, and fear. He reached up, grasping the heavy steel hatch. Before he secured it, he took one last, deep breath of the free, damp night air. Then, with a solid, echoing clank that felt loud enough to wake the entire town, he sealed himself in. He turned the pressure wheel, locking the hatch and isolating himself from the world. He was now alone, enclosed in a thin metal shell, about to trespass the most forbidden boundary in the USSR. He flicked a main switch. The electric motor hummed to life, a low, persistent vibration running through the hull. He checked his compass. West. Sweden. He pulled the dive plane lever. Slowly, silently, Pravda began to descend, melting away into the murky blackness of the harbor. The immediate descent was a triumph and a terror. Valentin manipulated the hand wheels, controlling the forward and aft ballast tanks, watching the rudimentary depth gauge needle climb, slowly past 5 meters. The water was shockingly cold, and the low, incessant hum of the electric motor was the only thing standing between him and the crushing silence of the deep. Inside the tiny compartment, The heat from the battery bank was already creating a stifling humidity, condensing on the metal walls. He wiped the condensation from the single, small plexiglass viewport he'd painstakingly fitted into the hatch cover. Outside, there was only blackness, occasionally broken by the eerie, swirling luminescence of microorganisms disturbed by the hull. His immediate goal was to traverse the Erb Strait, the critical, narrow passage between the Latvian coast and the Estonian island of Saaremaa. This area was not only heavily dredged, but was the main choke point monitored by the Soviet Navy's Baltic Fleet and the KGB border guards. He needed to stay deep enough to avoid detection by surface radar, but shallow enough to minimize the pressure on his homemade hull. He settled on a depth of 15 meters, a calculated risk. A depth charge or a close pass by a powerful sonar ping could still tear his vessel apart, but it was the best compromise. He checked his navigational aids. The gyro compass, though old, was working, holding a steady course of $270 / true west. The modified radio receiver, tuned to a narrow civilian frequency, was silent, which was good. No emergency broadcasts, no sudden calls to action for the local patrols. He knew, however, that he was entering the most dangerous phase. The Erb Strait was constantly traversed by Project 205, OSA class, missile boats and T-43, class minesweepers. The latter, in particular, carried sophisticated, low-frequency active sonar designed to detect non-metallic acoustic signatures, a system potentially capable of picking up the unique, quiet hum of his electric motor. To reduce his acoustic signature further, Valentin switched off the motor entirely. The submarine glided into an inertial drift. Now came the true physical test. He unstrapped the canvas cover from the bicycle pedal mechanism. It was a tight, awkward arrangement, requiring him to operate the rudder with his left hand while simultaneously pedaling with his legs, which were cramped into the restricted space. His body was already aching from the hours of preparation, but adrenaline pushed him. He began to pedal slowly, rhythmically, forcing the single-bladed propeller to turn, pushing the heavy vessel through the dense, cold water at a laborious speed of approximately 1 knot. The silence, now broken only by the squeak of the chain and his ragged breathing, was absolute, magnifying every sound from the world outside. He heard the distant, muffled thump-thump-thump of a large diesel engine, a surface vessel, getting closer. He stopped pedaling instantly, holding his breath, muscles locked. The sound grew louder, dominating his tiny world. He peered through the periscope, cranked upward just a few centimeters. Through the murky water and the lingering fog, he caught a glimpse of a dark, fast-moving shape. A border guard patrol vessel, likely a small P for class fast attack craft. It passed directly overhead. For a terrifying minute, the hull of Pravda vibrated violently from the patrol boat's powerful wake. Then, the rhythmic sound of the engine faded. It was gone. The close call reaffirmed the desperate need for silence and depth. He resumed pedaling, pushing himself harder, knowing that every meter he covered manually was a meter conserved on the battery charge, and more importantly, a meter closer to the deeper, less patrolled waters of the central Baltic. He pedaled for what felt like an eternity, but was perhaps only 90 minutes. His legs screamed, his lungs burned, and the taste of metallic fear was strong on his tongue. He had to surface soon, just long enough to use the periscope to confirm his position using the distant, blinking light of the Slitera lighthouse on the Latvian coast, a crucial navigational landmark, before he steered out into the featureless open sea. He cracked open the drain valve, letting in a small amount of seawater to the trimming tank, slightly adjusting his buoyancy. He prepared for the slow, agonizing ascent to periscope depth. Valentin carefully monitored the trimming tank gauge as he slowly flooded the external tanks, just enough to achieve neutral buoyancy. Then, using small, precise bursts of the electric motor, he began his ascent. It was a tedious process. A too rapid rise could create a noticeable pressure wave, easily detected by passive hydrophones positioned along the Erb Strait. He took 10 minutes to ascend the mere 5 meters to periscope depth, a shallow $10 meters. He locked the buoyancy controls and reached for the periscope controls. The brass tube, salvaged from a defunct military surplus shop and painstakingly modified, rose with a hydraulic hiss. He pressed his eye to the rubber eyepiece. The world snapped into view, a dizzying swirl of gray-green water, then the surface, a dark, rolling expanse under a thinning layer of fog. He rotated the periscope 360 degrees, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against the hull. The visibility was poor, but sufficient. To the northeast, the dark mass of the Saaremaa coast was barely discernible. To the east, the most critical reference point, the rhythmic, white flash of the Slitera lighthouse. It was exactly where it should be, a lonely, defiant beacon piercing the pre-dawn gloom. He quickly took a bearing and calculated his precise position on the small, laminated chart taped to the instrument panel. He was further along than he had dared hope, having successfully cleared the primary Soviet coastal sonar grid. Suddenly, a new sound cut through the silence, the distinct, high-frequency ping of active sonar. TSH ping. TSH ping. It was the unmistakable, metallic cry of a Soviet anti-submarine warfare, ASW vessel. It sounded distant, perhaps 5 to 7 kilometers away, but its presence was chilling. This was no routine patrol. This was a deliberate search. The pinging was too frequent, too aggressive. The Border Guard Command must have finally noticed the gap in their coastal coverage, or perhaps the vague inventory discrepancies had finally been flagged by Major Reznikov's sharp eye. Valentin instantly shoved the periscope down, retracted the hydroplane controls, and ordered a full, urgent flood of the forward ballast tanks. Pravda plummeted. He needed to get below the thermocline, the layer of water where the temperature changes rapidly. This thermal layer acts as an acoustic barrier, often refracting and scattering sonar waves, making it notoriously difficult for ASW equipment to locate objects beneath it. Based on his pre-voyage research of local oceanography, the thermocline in this area during late summer should be around $35 meters. The pressure mounted quickly as the tiny sub descended. At $25 meters, the hull began to emit low, unsettling groans, the sound of stressed metal. He fought the urge to panic, his mind racing through the calculations of the repurposed fuel tank's structural limits. He knew the steel was thick, designed for rail transport and pressure, but it was never meant for deep-sea immersion. He leveled off at a perilous 38 meters. The pinging continued, but now it sounded different, muffled, distorted, as if coming through a thick wall. He had found the acoustic shadow. He waited, rigid, listening to the strained symphony of his vessel. Seconds stretched into minutes. The hull continued to creak, a constant reminder of the crushing forces surrounding him. Then, directly above, he heard a new, terrifying noise. The deep, grinding roar of a propeller cavitation, the sound of a large ship speeding up, maneuvering directly toward his position. The sound was deafening, amplified by the water and the hull. He knew what this was, a Soviet minesweeper or small corvette, likely deploying a towed magnetic anomaly detector, MAD, or a sophisticated, dipping sonar. If they were equipped with modern sensors, they could detect the large battery mass inside Pravda even through the thermocline, or the pressure wave of his descent. His only defense was stillness and silence. He engaged the magnetic clutch for the electric motor, but only to hold it at 0 RPM, ensuring no accidental movement. His plan now was simple: stay silent, stay still, and wait for the Soviet vessel to pass, and assume he was either a patch of debris or a sonar ghost. He had a reserve of compressed air, his last resort, to quickly blow the tanks in an emergency ascent, but that would certainly announce his presence. He opted for the slow, agonizing, silent waiting game, his entire existence compressed into the small, humid space, defined only by the TSH ping of the enemy above and the structural groan of his homemade steel prison. The minutes dragged like hours, each one a silent plea for the ship to pass. The roar of the Soviet patrol vessel intensified, becoming a monstrous, metallic shriek directly overhead. Valentin knew this wasn't just a distant pass. The ASW crew had narrowed the search grid. He could hear the distinct sound of propeller wash, a churning turbulence indicating the ship was moving slowly, purposefully, likely dragging its sensors. He was directly beneath a threat. If they dropped a small practice charge or even activated their hull-mounted low-frequency transducer for a detailed sector scan, his thin hull would be immediately exposed. Suddenly, The continuous ping was joined by a second, deeper sound, a metallic, grinding clatter. It was the sound of a variable depth sonar VDS array being deployed, a massive, hydrodynamically shaped fish lowered into the water to penetrate the thermocline. The hunter was now actively probing his acoustic sanctuary. The VDS would be searching specifically for the size and density of his Hull, Massachusetts. Valentine's training snapped into focus, overriding his rising panic. He remembered a tactical maneuver taught during Soviet naval engineering courses, often disregarded as theoretical, exploiting the shadow of a pressure anomaly. His vessel was currently 38 meters deep. He needed to execute a silent, rapid ascent to 25 meters, using the pressure differences near the thermal layer to generate a momentary acoustic distortion, a kind of temporary camouflage. This was the riskiest move yet. A fast ascent would generate noise and could cause a pressure-induced leak. He reached for the compressed air valve, his hand trembling slightly. This was the one-shot emergency system. He had to be quick and precise. He cracked the valve open for exactly 2 seconds. The explosive hiss of high-pressure air rushing into the main ballast tank was deafening inside the small cockpit. Pravda surged upward, the needle on the depth gauge spinning wildly. He counteracted the lift with the downward angle of his rudimentary hydroplanes, struggling to stabilize the sudden momentum. He watched the gauge frantically. 35 meters, $30 meters. At 25 meters, he slammed the valve shut. The submarine briefly hung, suspended, before the residual upward force carried him to 22 meters. The hull groaned even louder during the ascent, the metal flexing violently. The instant he reached the new, shallower depth, the sonar's ping changed character. It was still loud, but now slightly fractured, distorted. The VDS, searching the bottom of the thermal layer, had lost the tight acoustic lock. He was in the confusing, fluctuating middle ground of the 20 to 30 meter band, where sound waves bounced unpredictably. Crucially, the patrol boat above had also reacted. He could hear the whine of its engines increasing power, attempting to maneuver quickly to reacquire the lost target. This momentary confusion was his only chance. He engaged the electric motor again, but only for a 5-second burst, pushing the throttle to full power, a deafening noise, but one that would hopefully be masked by the patrol boat's own propeller wash as it rapidly turned. He steered the submarine into a tight, $90 degree port turn, abandoning his straight westward path. He then killed the motor again. Now began the second phase of evasion, silent, manual drift. He returned to the bicycle pedals, pushing his aching muscles to their absolute limit, driving the sub silently away on the new northerly bearing, desperately seeking to place distance between himself and the Soviet vessel's last known position. The air inside the hull was thick, metallic tasting, and suffocatingly hot. His vision began to tunnel from the sheer physical exertion and the high concentration of carbon dioxide. He pedaled for another hour, a relentless, burning, silent flight through the cold water. Finally, the aggressive, rhythmic ping of the sonar faded entirely, replaced only by the dull, omnipresent sound of the sea. He risked a second, brief periscope sweep. Nothing but the vast, empty gray of the open Baltic. He had broken free of the Erb Strait's immediate coastal defense perimeter. But in doing so, he had used up a critical amount of his precious battery charge, and, more worryingly, had significantly deviated from his intended course. He was now deeper into the Soviet-controlled sea area than he should be. With the long, grueling stretch of the open Baltic, the second great challenge, still ahead of him, he reset his compass to the west, his body heavy, his resolve brittle but intact. The escape had just begun. Having escaped the immediate pursuit, Valentin Savitsky now faced the most brutal adversary, the sheer scale of the Baltic Sea. He was no longer dodging patrol boats in a narrow strait. He was traversing the open ocean, a vast, featureless expanse that demanded endless vigilance and punishing physical endurance. He calculated his position, roughly 50 nautical miles off the Soviet coast, a critical distance that placed him outside the routine range of the coastal border guard patrol zones, but still firmly within the operational area of the main Baltic fleet. He had to maintain maximum silence. The previous high-speed maneuvers had depleted his battery reserves to a worrying 60%. He switched entirely to manual propulsion. The electric motor was now reserved strictly for emergency maneuvers or final approach. Hours blurred into a relentless, exhausting cycle of pedaling and checking. The cramped conditions were turning his small compartment into a sensory deprivation chamber mixed with a furnace. The temperature, generated by the batteries and his own frantic exertion, hovered near 35 degrees Celsius, while the water outside was a chilling 4 degrees. Valentine developed a grueling rhythm, 1 hour of pedaling, pushing the sub at a slow but steady pace of 1.5 knots, followed by a mandatory 15-minute rest. During these rests, he would carefully trim the sub for neutral buoyancy and drift silently, using the time to monitor the hydrophone. The hydrophone, a simple, directional acoustic sensor he'd wired himself, was his only connection to the outside world. He listened for the telltale low-frequency thrum of a Project 641 Foxtrot class, conventional submarine, or the rapid slap-slap-slap of an ASW helicopter, both capable of operating far from shore. The psychological strain was immense. He was sealed inside a narrow metal tube, navigating by the faint glow of his instrument lights, entirely dependent on his own engineering and physical fortitude. The absolute darkness outside his viewport made the deep feel infinite, a heavy, silent presence, waiting to crush his makeshift vessel. He rationed his supplies, small sips of water from the thermos, half a slice of rye bread every 6 hours. The exhaustion was so profound that hallucinations began to creep in. He occasionally saw phantom flickers of light outside the viewport or heard non-existent voices over the static of the dead radio. He relied on the stars for navigational checks. Every few hours, he would perform a snorkeling ascent, bringing the sub just below the surface, raising his modified periscope, and taking an astronomical sight using his cheap, surplus sextant. The stars, cold and distant, provided the only reliable compass in the middle of the sea. By the second night, he confirmed he was on course, heading toward the Swedish island of Gotland, the primary staging point for his final leg to the Swedish mainland. The second night also brought the second major threat. At approximately 3 o'clock, the hydrophone began to hiss with a complex acoustic signature. Multiple diesel engines, deep and powerful, moving at speed. This was not a single patrol boat. This was a convoy, or worse, a naval task group. Valentine immediately ordered a deep dive, flooding the ballast tanks without compressed air to minimize noise, relying on gravity and hydroplanes. He descended silently to 45 meters, pushing the structural limits again. The sounds, now muffled by the depth, passed overhead. He identified the unmistakable signatures of large military transports escorted by 1 or 2 Grisha-class corvettes. The fleet passed without incident, but the sheer presence of so much Soviet military hardware, the colossal, unquestioned power of the state he was fleeing, was a chilling reminder of his vulnerability. When the sounds finally faded, Valentine did not immediately surface. He stayed at 45 meters for a further 2 hours, utterly still, simply drifting westward, allowing the silent current to aid his journey. He finally resurfaced to periscope depth just as the pale, gray light of a new dawn was breaking over the Baltic. He had survived the 2 most dangerous nights. He was now approximately 90 nautical miles from the Latvian coast and nearly 60 nautical miles from the nearest neutral waters. The hardest physical labor was still ahead, but the worst of the Soviet coastal surveillance was, hopefully, behind him. He started pedaling again, his muscles screaming, pushing the tiny Pravda further into the empty, cold freedom. The third day brought a new set of challenges, exposure. While night offered the cloak of darkness, the rising sun turned the Baltic into a vast, unforgiving mirror, where a surface anomaly like Pravda could be spotted from miles away by aircraft or high-mounted radar. Valentine made the difficult decision to spend the daylight hours primarily submerged at his maximum safe depth of 40 meters, using the bicycle pedals continuously to maintain forward momentum. This conserved his batteries, but pushed his physical limits past the breaking point. The lack of natural light made his confinement almost unbearable. Time lost all meaning. The world was reduced to the cramped, sweaty space, the rhythmic squeak-squeak of the pedals, and the low, distant rumble of commercial shipping traffic, which he was attempting to avoid by keeping well south of the main shipping lanes. The constant pressure on his legs and back was agonizing. He attempted to distract himself by meticulously reviewing the engineering plans he carried in his mind. The integrity of the welded seams, the remaining oxygen levels, which were managed by simple potassium superoxide scrubbers he had devised, and the slow but steady depletion of his water supply. Midday brought an unexpected turn. The hydrophone, which had been registering only distant freighter noise, began to pick up a rapidly escalating, complex sound pattern. Not engines, but an unnerving, low percussion. The sound was the ocean itself turning violent. A fast-moving, unpredicted gale was sweeping across the central Baltic. Valentin knew the extreme danger this posed. A storm would create massive pressure differentials in the water column and cause violent, unpredictable currents. More immediately, the severe wave action on the surface could create a phenomenon known as pumping, where the low-frequency pressure from the waves could subject his shallow-running submarine to powerful, cyclical forces capable of rupturing the hull. He had to seek the safety of the deeper water, but first, he needed to secure his vessel against becoming a tumbling toy in the churning water. He immediately stopped pedaling, switched on the main lights, and began securing every loose item inside the cabin, which amounted to his small chart, his wrench, and the thermos. He slammed the hydroplanes to a full-down angle and purged the trimming tank, aiming for 45 meters, a depth he had hoped never to reach, but which might offer protection from the surface chaos. As Pravda descended, the pressure changes became violent. The low groans of the hull turned into sharp, terrifying cracks as the stress plates fought against the weight of the sea. Water began to seep through the seals of the forward viewport, not a gush, but a steady, alarming drip, 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 pooling quickly on the metal floor. He frantically used a small hand pump to try and clear the bilge, his heart hammering in his chest. At 45 meters, the rocking began. It wasn't the gentle sway of normal currents. It was a vicious, short-period tumbling motion. The small cabin became a violent centrifuge, throwing Valentin against the instrument panel. The compass needle spun wildly useless. For several minutes, he clung to the control handles, simply enduring the beating, praying the hull would hold. The submarine was essentially a lead-weighted can being tossed in a gigantic, unseen hand. The worst moment came when the main electric power panel, the modified trolleybus switchboard, short-circuited with a blinding, acrid flash and a loud pop. The lights went out instantly. He was plunged into absolute, suffocating darkness, the only sound the violent sloshing of the bilge water and the rhythmic, terrible creaking of the hull. He frantically fumbled for his emergency flashlight, his hand slick with sweat and oil. When the beam cut through the darkness, he saw the damage. A minor fire was sparking on the power panel, caused by seawater ingress from the leaky viewport. He grabbed a fire extinguisher, a small, repurposed chemical unit, and managed to smother the electrical fire. The immediate danger passed, but the core issue remained. The storm raged above, and his main power system was compromised. He was stranded deep, battered, and adrift, his vital electric propulsion potentially useless. His escape had suddenly become a fight for sheer survival against the indifference of the open ocean. He checked the depth gauge, $48 meters. He had unintentionally dropped even lower. He knew he had to get shallower and attempt to surface repair the moment the storm abated, or the pressure would compromise the hull entirely. The darkness was total and suffocating, interrupted only by the narrow beam of Valentin's battery-powered emergency lamp. The air was thick with the smell of burned insulation and salt water. The storm above continued to rage, rocking Pravda violently at its perilous depth of 48 meters. Every movement inside the cramped cabin risked a dangerous fall against the sharp edges of the controls. He knew he had minutes, not hours, to rectify the situation. The continuous stress at this depth was structurally unsustainable for a vessel of his amateur construction. Valentin's first priority was the breach in the viewport seal. Using the small beam of light, he identified the exact point of the leak, a fatigued piece of rubber gasket. He quickly grabbed a roll of specialized marine-grade sealing tape he had saved for extreme emergencies and, working with his numb, trembling hands, managed to tear away the loose gasket material and apply the sticky, thick tape over the seam. The flow of water slowed immediately, then stopped. A small, immediate victory, but the main issue, the fried electrical system, remained. He repositioned himself in front of the main power panel, a complex tangle of wires, relays, and switches he had meticulously designed. The flash fire had erupted at the connection point between the heavy-duty battery bank and the motor controller, the junction where the 120-volt power was regulated. He knew that the seawater, even a few drops, could bridge the high-voltage connections, creating the short that had knocked out his main power. Working in the confined space was brutal. He had to wedge himself against the ballast tank controls, twisting his body to reach the damaged components. He used a small, insulated screwdriver and a pair of pliers, the tools catching the dim light. He could see the scorched copper and the melted plastic of the relays. The damage was extensive. To bypass the ruined section of the control board and restore power to the motor, he would have to perform a high-risk, direct wire splice, connecting the main battery feed directly to the motor's input, bypassing all safety regulators and the throttle control. This meant two things. First, the motor would only have two speeds, off or maximum throttle. Second, he risked frying the motor entirely or causing a catastrophic battery meltdown. He had no choice. With extreme caution, he isolated the main current by pulling the heavy, ceramic safety fuses, giving himself a momentary reprieve from the danger of electrocution. He then stripped the thick, 3-gauge wires, twisting the bare copper ends together with the pliers, securing the splice with 3 layers of heavy, vulcanized rubber insulation tape he'd acquired from a military shipyard. The whole process took nearly 45 agonizing minutes, time during which Pravda continued its slow, terrifying descent as the storm raged. The depth gauge now showed 49 meters. When the repair was complete, he paused, took a deep, shuddering breath of the stale, humid air, and prepared for the moment of truth. He reinserted the safety fuses. With a final, silent plea for luck, he reached for the newly bypassed main power switch and engaged it. For a terrifying, heart-stopping second, nothing happened. Then, the heavy-duty electric motor at the stern of the sub gave a massive, jarring lurch and roared to life at full, unregulated power. The vibration was immense, threatening to shake the whole fragile vessel apart. The heat emanating from the now wide-open motor was intense. But the essential fact was this: Pravda had power. He immediately engaged the upward hydroplanes and fought to stabilize the sub's depth. The full power of the motor, even briefly applied, sent the sub rocketing upward. He managed to level off at 20 meters, a safe, but still turbulent depth. He killed the power instantly. The sound of the motor stopping was replaced by the blissful sound of silence, apart from the continuing creaking of the hull. He was forced back to manual propulsion. The repair had worked, but it had come at a heavy cost. His motor was now a single-use escape mechanism, only to be engaged in the direst emergency. He was completely reliant on the silent, back-breaking labor of the bicycle pedals. More critically, his unplanned descent had cost him distance, pushing him off his intended course and closer to the heavily mined and potentially sensitive sea zones around Gotland. He checked his gyro compass. He was drifting south of his desired line. The hours of manual pedaling stretched ahead, a daunting, physical penance for the brief, violent panic of the storm. Valentin re-established his westward course, settling into the mind-numbing labor of the manual propulsion. The adrenaline that had fueled the repair was fading, replaced by a deep, bone-weary exhaustion. His legs felt like lead, his muscles screaming with every turn of the crank. He was a human engine, powered by pure desperation, driving a 4-ton steel can toward freedom. He set a new, tighter schedule, 90 minutes of constant, focused pedaling, followed by 10 minutes of passive, silent drift. During the drift, he would check the gyro compass for drift and use the brief respite to perform critical maintenance, wiping down the continuous condensation that threatened the electronics and making small, internal structural checks. He discovered that the relentless shaking during the storm had slightly loosened the seal on his emergency compressed air tank. A faint, almost inaudible hiss was escaping. He tightened the fitting with his large wrench, but the small loss was another critical, non-replaceable resource gone. His progress was agonizingly slow, averaging just over 1 knot. But with every turn of the propeller, the distance to neutral waters decreased. He estimated he was now approximately 30 nautical miles from the southern tip of Gotland, the large, strategically important Swedish island. The approach to Gotland was his final navigational hurdle. This area was known to be heavily monitored by Swedish coastal defense forces, who were extremely sensitive to foreign, especially Soviet, submarine incursions. His fear was not capture by the Soviets now, but a hostile encounter with the neutral Swedes, who might mistake his homemade craft for an advanced, stealthy Soviet intelligence vessel and potentially engage with depth charges. To mitigate this risk, he planned an extremely shallow approach. He would surface to periscope depth, 10 meters, and use the cover of the rapidly approaching evening twilight for his final, decisive burst of travel. As the sun began to dip toward the horizon, painting the surface a bruised, metallic purple, Valentin initiated his planned descent. He flooded the trimming tank slowly, meticulously, controlling the rate of rise to avoid any pressure anomalies. At 10 meters, he raised the periscope. The sight was breathtaking and terrifying. Directly ahead, visible in the deepening gloom, was the hazy, dark silhouette of the Gotland coastline. He had made it across the open sea. However, the periscope also revealed a new, immediate danger. Running a parallel course to the coast, about 5 miles off his port side, was a large, fast-moving vessel. It was painted white and gray, the color scheme of a Swedish Coast Guard patrol boat, likely a KBV 301 class vessel. It was equipped with powerful, modern radar and sonar. He immediately dropped the periscope and returned to deep, silent running. The Coast Guard vessel was moving faster than he could pedal. He had to assume it was running a radar sweep. He engaged the one-shot electric motor for a brief, 30-second burst, a massive gamble on his remaining battery power, to push his sub into a radical, deep curve toward the coast, seeking the safety of the shallow, rocky shelf surrounding Gotland. The motor roared, the hull vibrated fiercely, and the battery gauge dropped sharply. He killed the power and returned to his pedals, driving himself forward with frantic, renewed energy. The shallow coastal waters posed their own lethal threat, mines and rocky bottom hazards. He had to rely on his memory of outdated, open-source navigational charts. He was aiming for a specific, small, and relatively unpopulated bay on the southern coast. He reduced his depth to a mere 5 meters and, for the first time, used the low-intensity lights inside the cockpit to study the small, forward viewport. He could now make out the water immediately in front of the sub, dark, murky, and dangerously shallow. Suddenly, a massive, grinding S-80 shuddered through the entire hull. Pravda had struck the bottom, a submerged, rocky outcrop. The sub stopped dead, the momentum slamming Valentin forward against his harness. The pressure gauge flickered violently. He had not ruptured the hull, but the submarine was momentarily stuck, tilted at an uncomfortable, worrying 30-degree angle, wedged fast on the Swedish seabed, just meters from freedom. The silence following the violent scrape and sudden halt was more profound than any deep water isolation. Valentin hung awkwardly in his harness, the small cabin tilted severely. The collision had not breached the hull, a testament to the repurposed rail tank's inherent strength, but the impact had jarred everything. The small kerosene lamp he used as backup lighting had fallen, shattering against the battery bank cover, instantly plunging the cabin into darkness again. A strong smell of stale seawater and raw metal filled the air. He immediately checked the depth gauge. It read 4.5 meters. He was stuck on a submerged rock formation just below the surface, meters from the Swedish shore. He was close enough to freedom to taste it, yet firmly held in the grip of the Baltic seabed. The danger was exponential. At this depth, any passing boat would easily detect the hull via rudimentary sonar or even visual inspection in the morning light. The Swedish Coast Guard vessel was still operating nearby, its engine noise occasionally audible over his passive hydrophone. Valentin tried the obvious first, full forward propeller. He re-engaged the jerry-rigged electric motor. It roared to life at maximum power, vibrating the entire submarine into a frenzy, but the vessel remained stubbornly wedged. He tried full reverse, the hull shaking violently as the thruster churned up sand and sediment. Still no movement. The submarine was pinned fast. He was burning up his last remaining battery charge on a futile effort. He immediately cut the power. The only option left was to change the ballast configuration. If he could dramatically alter the trim, he might be able to shift the weight and roll Pravda off the rock. He decided to execute a rapid, full emergency blow of the forward ballast tank, using his precious, dwindling store of compressed air to make the bow suddenly buoyant, ideally tipping the stern off the obstruction. He took a deep breath and opened the main air valve. The hiss was instantaneous and loud, the air rushing into the forward tank. He held it open until the pressure gauge dropped to a critical low. The nose of the submarine responded, rising sharply. The entire vessel groaned and twisted, and with a terrible, drawn-out riot of steel against granite, Pravda slid free. He immediately counteracted the sudden buoyancy by venting air and taking in water, desperate to avoid a chaotic, uncontrolled surface breach that would certainly attract the attention of the Swedish patrol. He leveled off at a safer 7 meters, the bilge now containing a worrying quantity of water from the jarring impact. He was floating free, but the cost was nearly his entire reserve of compressed air. His electrical power was almost exhausted, showing a mere 10% charge. He had to rely completely on the manual pedals for the final stage. The urgency was immense. He was in Swedish territorial waters, a fact that both saved and endangered him. The goal was no longer the mainland, but simply to reach the beach, run the vessel aground, and surrender to the Swedish authorities. He pushed the sub forward, pedaling with a desperate, last-ditch surge of energy. He steered directly toward a small, dark crescent of beach visible through the viewport. He was moving at barely walking pace. The water became increasingly shallow. He could see the dark, shifting pattern of the sandy bottom just below the hull. Then, just as his strength began to completely fail, the nose of Pravda finally ground into the soft, gritty sand. 17 meters from the Swedish shoreline, he collapsed onto the floor of the cockpit, the bicycle chain still wrapped around his ankle. He had done it. He had traversed the Baltic, evaded the Soviet Navy, survived a storm and a grounding. Now came the final, most exposed act. He had to surface and exit the vessel. He released the remaining pressure from the ballast tanks, and Pravda, relieved of its weight, slowly bobbed up through the final meters of water, breaching the surface with a gentle slosh. The cold, fresh air hit Valentine's face as he spun the release wheel on the hatch. The steel disc was heavy, but with a final grunt of effort, he pushed it open. He climbed out onto the slick, wet hull, breathing in the cold, free air of neutral territory. The time was 5:40, and the light of dawn was just beginning to touch the distant clouds. He had sailed from Ventspils to Gotland in just under 3 days. He stood on the deck of his homemade submarine, a figure of silent, resolute defiance, looking towards the dark, silent pine forest of Sweden. Valentine stood motionless on the wet, barnacle-studded hull of Pravda, the cold wind off the sea a shocking contrast to the humid heat he'd endured for 3 days. The air smelled of pine resin and clean water, a smell he instinctively recognized as freedom, distinct from the heavily industrialized, oil-tinged air of Ventspils. His legs, cramped and unused for the last 3 days, threatened to give out. He forced himself to move, carefully lowering himself from the hull into the shallow, icy water. The chilling contact was a painful, yet galvanizing, shock. He dragged himself ashore, collapsing onto the coarse, grayish-white sand of the small, secluded beach. He lay there for a minute, chest heaving, listening to the gentle lapping of the waves, the soft sound of a world that was no longer actively trying to kill or capture him. He looked back at his submarine, the culmination of 3 years of desperate, secret labor. It was a crude, scarred metallic cylinder, but to him, it was the only truth that mattered. He knew he couldn't stay. His first objective was to establish contact with the Swedish authorities and claim asylum. He forced himself to his feet, turning toward the dense thicket of spruce and pine that marked the edge of the forest. The shore was completely deserted. About half a kilometer inland, an elderly Swedish fisherman, Stig Anderson, was preparing for his morning trawl. Stig lived in a small, isolated cabin near the coast, his life governed by the sea and the seasons. He was on his porch, coiling a line, when he noticed an anomaly on the beach below, a dark, cylindrical object, sitting half submerged in the shallows. Initially, He dismissed it as a piece of naval debris, perhaps a lost buoy or a section of pipeline. But as the light improved, the shape resolved itself into something unmistakably deliberate, too large and complex for flotsam. Stig grabbed his powerful marine binoculars. What he saw shocked him to his core. It was a small submarine, clearly homemade, and standing beside it, a figure in mud-caked, dark clothing, a man, looking utterly exhausted, his face gaunt and covered in several days' growth of beard. The sight, in the highly sensitive military zone of Gotland, immediately screamed Soviet incursion. Sweden, throughout the 1980s, had been plagued by dozens of alleged sightings of foreign, always assumed to be Soviet, ghost submarines violating its territorial waters. For Stig, this was not a sighting. It was a physical, undeniable presence. Stig, a veteran of the Swedish Coastal Defense Reserves, did not hesitate. He dropped the binoculars, grabbed the wall-mounted radiophone, and frantically dialed the local Säkerhetspolisen, SAPO, the Swedish Security Service, hotline, which was routed through the local police station in Visby. Minutes later, Valentin, having walked perhaps 50 meters up the beach, heard the distant, unmistakable whine of a rapidly approaching vehicle. He stopped, turning to face the sound. The noise grew louder, resolving into the sound of a jeep driving fast over the rough, unpaved coastal road. The first official responders were two uniformed Gotland police officers, Officer Lena Olsen and Sergeant Lars Jensen, followed closely by a plainclothes agent from SAPO. They skidded to a halt near the treeline, their eyes fixed on the bizarre scene, the man and his crude, black vessel. The officers emerged from the jeep, hands instinctively resting on the holstered pistols. Olsen spoke first, shouting in Swedish, her voice sharp with caution. "Stop! Raise your hand slowly." Valentin did not understand the words, but the command in the tone was universal. He slowly raised his arms. He then spoke the only phrase he had rehearsed for this moment, his voice hoarse and cracked from thirst. "I am a Soviet citizen. I request political asylum." He then pointed back towards the submarine, offering his evidence to the stunned Swedish officers. The officers exchanged a look of disbelief and intense concern. This was not a routine matter of a lost tourist. This was an international incident, a tangible Soviet defector arriving on a physical military vessel of his own creation, on a Swedish beach, a few hours before the morning papers would be printed. Sergeant Jensen immediately pulled out his radio and called headquarters. "We have a situation. Code red. Submarine incursion confirmed. Solo defector apprehended. Soviet origin suspected. Request immediate support from Navy and SAPO Command." The Cold War had just washed up on the shores of neutral Sweden. The arrival of Valentin Savitsky on the Swedish beach instantly transformed a clandestine personal escape into a high-stakes international incident. Within the hour, the isolated beach on Gotland was swarming. The initial police contingent was reinforced by heavily armed soldiers from the Swedish Coastal Artillery, tasked with securing the area, and a large team of specialists from the National Police Board, Rikspolisstyrelsen, and SAPO. The entire area was sealed off. Perimeter patrols were established to prevent press intrusion, though rumors were already rocketing through the local populace. Valentin himself was taken immediately into custody. He was not treated as a criminal, but as a potential intelligence asset and, crucially, as the center of a diplomatic storm. He was transported under heavy guard to a secure military facility near Visby. There, he was debriefed by a joint team of Swedish military intelligence officers and SAPO agents. His story, told in halting Russian and broken German, was meticulously recorded and compared against the physical evidence of the homemade submarine. The vessel, Pravda, became the focal point of intense scrutiny. Swedish naval engineers and intelligence analysts descended upon the site. They studied the crude, ingenious design, the repurposed fuel tank hull, the bicycle pedal drive system, the salvaged avionics, and the rudimentary oxygen scrubbers. They were astonished by the sheer audacity and technical skill required to build and operate such a craft. The Soviet Union had spent billions on sophisticated ASW systems to monitor the Baltic. Yet this single, desperate man had slipped through it all in a vehicle constructed in a backyard shed. The technical assessment confirmed Savitsky's story. This was genuinely a homemade craft, not a piece of advanced Soviet naval technology. Back in Moscow, the news of the defection, which reached the Kremlin within hours through diplomatic channels, caused a profound shock and institutional panic. For the KGB and the Border Guard Command, the incident was a colossal embarrassment. The defection proved, in the most spectacular and physical way possible, that the USSR's vaunted impenetrable coastal defenses were a myth. Major Viktor Reznikov in Ventspils, the officer who had previously dismissed the minor inventory discrepancies, was immediately taken into a rigorous, punishing internal investigation. The KGB demanded the immediate extradition of Savitsky, officially labeling him a thief of state property and a dangerous lunatic. The demands were, predictably, rejected by the Swedes. The Swedish government, caught between its long-standing neutrality and the desire to expose the Soviet security failure, handled the matter with shrewd diplomacy. They officially confirmed the arrival of a Soviet citizen seeking asylum and the discovery of a small, personally constructed underwater vehicle. They carefully leaked details of the sub's crude construction to the Western press, fueling an international media frenzy. The image of the desperate inventor and his homemade submarine, a David and Goliath story, became a global symbol of the repressive nature of the Soviet state. Within days, Valentin Savitsky was granted political asylum by the Kingdom of Sweden. He was a hero in the West, celebrated as a testament to the enduring human desire for freedom and the innovative spirit stifled by totalitarianism. His story served as a powerful propaganda coup for NATO countries. The fate of his submarine, Pravda, was equally symbolic. After being thoroughly documented and analyzed by the Swedish military, the Swedish government chose to keep the vessel. It was eventually placed in a naval museum, not merely as a curiosity, but as a concrete, physical artifact of the Cold War, a tiny, defiant metal cylinder that had defeated the mightiest naval patrol system on the Baltic. Valentin Savitsky, the naval engineer who had built his freedom with his own hands, slowly began to build a new life in Sweden. He was a silent, intense man, forever marked by the physical and psychological toll of his journey. But he was free, and his journey, the 3-day, one-man voyage across a hostile sea, remained one of the most remarkable and shocking escapes in the final years of the Cold War, a stark, metallic reminder of the desperation that defined life behind the Iron Curtain.